September 1960. At SAAB, the engineering teams were staring at something that shouldn't have been possible. On paper, the ejection system was perfect. Dummy ejections had gone exactly as planned. Ground trials, static tests, qualification reviews, signed off, approved, cleared for service, nothing was missing. Nothing was out of limits, and yet in the space of 3 months, 2 pilots had been lost. Both losses occurred in aircraft that had been declared ready for frontline service. But something fundamental had been overlooked. When the cause of the problems was finally discovered, the response was immediate. Every Draken was grounded. Dozens of Sweden's supersonic interceptors were sat idle whilst engineers redesigned a system that was supposed to have been ready before the first aircraft even entered service. The grounding lasted weeks, not months, but it was long enough to make one thing brutally clear. Building Draken had been the easy part, making it safe enough for operational squadrons to be flown by men who weren't test pilots. That was the hard part. And in the autumn of 1960, Sweden learned that lesson the only way it ever seems to be learned, by paying for it first. March 1960. The first production J35A models arrived at F-13 wing at Norrköping. By summer, a long line of shiny new Drakens were sitting on the apron. For pilots transitioning from the tubby J29 to NAN, Draken looked like they'd been designed by someone imagining what aircraft in the future would look like and deciding to build it ahead of schedule. The official reports described the introduction as very smooth, with F-13 wing taking only a year to fully phase out to NANs and reach full operational status on Draken. By the end of 1960, multiple wings were equipped with production aircraft. Sweden finally had its supersonic interceptor force. Scramble times were satisfactory and turnaround times met expectations. But calling it smooth papered over certain realities that became apparent once pilots started pushing the aircraft. The first indications of problems came 3 months after deliveries began. 7th of June 1960, Major Stig Olaf Haig was flying aircraft 35018 on exercise when it entered a superstall. The aircraft pitched up, stopped flying, and began that characteristic flat descent, the falling leaf pattern that test pilots had documented in the Draken years earlier. Major Haig knew the recovery procedure: stick full aft, wait for the forward swing, snap it forward to break the stall. But the aircraft was falling too fast, altitude was bleeding away too quickly. He reached for the ejection handle, the explosive charges fired, the sequence started, and the canopy should have been blown clear. But instead, it just nudged upwards slightly and then dropped back into place. Major Haig was now trapped inside the fallen aircraft, the ejection seat beneath him, ready to fire, but blocked by the canopy that refused to clear. He didn't survive. 3 months later, 7th of September 1960, 2 Drakens were being flown in a training exercise filming for the Swedish Air Force. While around 10,000 feet, Draken 35014, flown by pilot Sture Hermann, struck the second Draken, piloted by Lieutenant Lars Bertil Persson, from above and behind. The impact tore the fin and the entire right outer wing clean of Persson's aircraft. He tried to eject, but the sequence failed. With the aircraft coming apart around him, the canopy finally separated, not because the ejection system worked, but because the structural damage was so severe it simply tore away from a disintegrating airframe. Persson fell out of the cockpit, his parachute deployed, and he landed without a scratch. Sture Hermann wasn't as fortunate. The investigation into the early Draken fatalities turned up an ugly truth. The first generation ejection systems in the J35A and B models had a deadly flaw. Before the seat could fire, the canopy had to be clear of the aircraft. However, the canopy plungers, small explosive charges designed to kick the transparency clear before the rockets of the seat fired, were simply too short to generate sufficient force. In wind tunnels and on test rigs with controlled airflow, they'd worked perfectly. SAAB's engineers had tested the system extensively. But there's a difference between controlled test conditions and the chaos of an actual emergency with real airflow loads and a pilot fighting for survival in an uncontrolled descent. The plungers just nudged the canopy upward before it dropped back into place, blocking the seat, firing mechanism and trapping the pilot inside with nowhere to go. After those accidents, the early ejection seat was no longer treated as finished, it was treated as for what it actually was, incomplete. SAAB and the Air Force rolled out a series of modifications, each aimed at eliminating specific issues that had only shown up once operational squadrons started pushing the aircraft. Manual release handles were added on both sides of the seat, so if the automatic sequence failed, the pilot now had a way to intervene and eject the canopy. Finally, the system got more powerful seat cartridges and a redesigned leg fixation system. This was to reduce the risk of limb flail during ejection. None of these changes were revolutionary on their own, but together they transformed Draken's ejection system from something that worked in tests into something that worked when pilots actually needed it, and of course that distinction mattered. The improved ejection system would eventually be retrofitted across the fleet, but that upgrade came too late for Major Haig and Pilot Herman. Beyond the ejection seat problem, operational pilots were discovering other issues. At near sonic speeds and low altitude, the aircraft's pitch controls were dangerously sensitive, too aggressive on the stick, and the aircraft could enter violent oscillations, or worse, negative G, followed by what pilots called galloping, where the nose pitched up and down uncontrollably. From what I could gather, the emergency recovery procedure was as follows, and it spoke volumes. Disconnect the autopilot or let go of the stick entirely, and when the oscillation stopped, abort the mission and land immediately. Not exactly confidence inspiring for pilots whose job it was to intercept Soviet bombers at high Mach. The first Drakens to hit the squadrons was the J35A designated Adam. This was powered by the Svenska Flygmotor RM6B engine that produced around 15,000 pounds of thrust with the Swedish-built EBK-65 afterburner lit. That power plant could push the aircraft to Mach 1.7 in level flight under clean test conditions, operationally closer to Mach 1.6, making it one of the fastest Western interceptor, faster than most NATO interceptors of the period. The J35A was armed with two 30mm Aiden cannon mounted in inner sections of the wings, outboard of the engine intakes, with one cannon in each wing firing through ports in the leading edge, along with two RB-24 missiles or six 13.5cm Arak rockets, 3 under each wing. If needed, the J35A could also carry up to 4 missiles, 1 under each wing, and a twin launch rack fitted to a centerline pylon. SAAB had intended to fit the J35A with the Swedish designed PS-03 radar, but that program was running behind schedule. The interim solution was to import and fit the French Thomson CSF Serrano system, given the Swedish designation PS-02/A, and paired with the SAAB S6 gyro gun sight. The PS-02A was, to use the official assessment, only modestly effective with limited range and virtually no protection against electronic countermeasures. It was said that the detection ranges were short and the radar was essentially an advanced rangefinder rather than a true search and track system. Functionally, the J35A was more or less restricted to tail chase intercepts, which is fine for catching subsonic bombers from astern once ground control had vectored you close enough, but less useful for head-on collision course intercepts or against anything maneuvering vigorously. Pilots developed opinions about the aircraft quickly. Boss Enberg, who flew Draken operationally during the 1980s, summarized the type succinctly: reliable, unique design, sports car. instantaneous turn rates were excellent. Draken could snap into a tight turn and pull 9G without complaint, responding quickly to control inputs. Sustained maneuvering, on the other hand, was another matter. That massive delta wing generated tremendous drag when pitched up hard, bleeding speed at an alarming rate. Hold a 7G turn for more than a few seconds and you'd watch the airspeed indicator drop, forcing pilots to manage throttle carefully or risk becoming slow, vulnerable and an easy target. Not to mention the landings that had pilots' eyes on stalks, watching their angle of attack meter like Swedish hawks, especially on short runways while maintaining the right amount of power. But the A model was always a transitional aircraft. A true leap forward came when the Bertil arrived in February 1962. This variant was a huge capability increase and was the first Draken to be fully integrated into Sweden's Sterile 60 Combat Guidance Network, the national air defense system that coordinated ground radars, control centers and data links across the entire country. For a nation with an extensive coastline and dispersed highway bases stretching from the Arctic to the Baltic, this integration meant intercepts could be coordinated with minimal radio chatter that Soviet signals intelligence could track, although I've yet to meet a chatty Swede. More importantly, the J35B became the first Swedish aircraft fitted with the Steer data system, a one-way digital data link that let ground controllers transmit intercept commands directly to the aircraft's computers. The pilot could read intercept geometry, target information, and tactical commands on cockpit displays rather than trying to listen to radio calls while simultaneously flying and searching for a target. It was the 1960s equivalent of having GPS navigation instructions appear on your windscreen rather than following verbal directions whilst driving. But the real capability jump was to come from the radar itself. The 35B was to finally get the Swedish designed PS-03 system that the A model was supposed to have gotten. Unlike the French system, with its limited range and vulnerability to jamming, the PS-03 was to give Draken proper collision course intercept capability. The aircraft could now engage targets from any aspect, not just from astern. Head-on intercepts against incoming bombers became possible, and the pilot could attack before Soviet crews even knew a Swedish interceptor was in the area. Day or night, any weather conditions, any angle, exactly what Sweden needed. Though, predictably, with early complex technology, there was a complication. The PS-03 radar still wasn't ready when the first B-model airframes began rolling off the production line. Early aircraft designated the J35B Prim or B Prime rolled out without any radar whatsoever. Instead, they got the gun sights salvaged from retired J29 Tenans. But despite this fact, these sights were actually quite versatile. They could work as both gyro sights, calculating lead for moving targets, and conventional reflex sights, and could even be used to aim its RB-24 missiles, well, in a fashion, against airborne targets. But it was still a supersonic interceptor with improvised sighting equipment from a subsonic fighter. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. However, on January 14, 1960, a Bertil fitted with a slightly modified British Rolls-Royce Avon Mark 48A, designated RM6BE in Sweden, did something quite special. Imagine this. That day, test pilot Erik Dahlström strapped himself into a J35B, fired up the engine and climbed to altitude. Once there, he advanced the throttle past military power, lighting the afterburner to start his run. With the immense power of the engine, the double delta easily punched through Mach 1, and the speed would keep climbing. Dahlström no doubt keeping his eyes on the Mach meter as it crept upward. 1.4, 1.6, 1.8. Outside, the winter sky over Sweden turning darker blue as the aircraft climbed through 40,000 feet. The engine, pushing out 17,400 pounds of thrust, was driving Draken faster than any Swedish aircraft had ever flown. Finally, there it was, 2.0. Dahlstrom held the speed, checking the instruments, feeling the aircraft's response. The controls remained crisp, no buffeting, no vibration. Brat's double delta wing was doing exactly what the calculations had predicted. He throttled back, beginning a gentle descent to land. Sweden had done it, built a Mach 2 interceptor that actually worked. Although for clarity, it wouldn't be until the Davids with the RM-6C that Mach 2 would be considered routine. 73 J35B aircraft were delivered to F-16 wing starting February 1962. Between 64 and 65, the early B Prim aircraft were returned to SAAB for conversion to full J35B standard with the PS-03/A radar and the S7 sight system. During this period, F-18 wing at Tullinge decided to show the world what the interceptor could do. In 1963, the Swedish Air Force formed the Acro Deltas, its jet aerobatic team flying Draken, replacing the Acro Hunters who had flown the Hawker Hunter for many years. These aircraft with highly distinctive blue and yellow markings became instant crowd favourites, putting on some of the noisiest air shows throughout the 1960s. For audiences who'd only seen conventional fighters, watching Delta Wing Drakens execute tight formations and snap into high G turns must have been genuinely impressive. Plus, they got to see what their tax krona had paid for. But the Acro Deltas weren't just entertainment. The team showed Draken could be pushed hard, that Swedish pilots had mastered the aircraft's quirks, and that Sweden's air defense capability was visible and formidable. But display flying also carried risks. On the 14th of December 1971, one of the Acro Deltas, aircraft 35223, flown by pilot Klaus Kronenborg, was lost after colliding with the sea during a low-level maneuver. The SK-35C Caesar was a different kind of challenge entirely. Building a two-seat trainer variant of a tailless Delta isn't straightforward. You're adding weight, increasing drag, shifting the center of gravity, and potentially creating an aircraft that handles completely differently from the single-seaters, which would make it useless as a training platform. The decision to build a trainer hadn't been straightforward either. SAAB's test pilots, who'd been flying Drakens since their prototype days, insisted landing characteristics were manageable compared to the J-29 Tunan, despite the tubby fighter having experienced numerous accidents. No special trainer was needed. But the Swedish Air Force pilots disagreed. Once squadron pilots started transitioning to the type, the assessment changed. The high angle of attack landings, the superstall characteristics, the pitch sensitivity, all of it added up to an aircraft that needed proper dual instruction. The memory of Major Haig's death was still fresh, and foreign air forces were increasingly adopting two-seat trainers for their advanced jets. So the Swedish Air Force got its trainer. SAAB's solution was elegant. Tandem seating with the rear cockpit raised higher than the front to give the instructor visibility over the student's head, along with a 3D stereoscopic periscope. This layout kept those lovely curves that we all love. Despite the raised rear seat, the canopy line retained most of the single-seat aerodynamics, SAAB having worked really carefully to prevent any issues that could have compromised handling. And performance was nearly identical to the single-seaters, with only slight reduction from increased weight and drag. Crucially, the SK-35C had the Aiden cannons and radar removed to save weight. While researching, I came across conflicting accounts whether the SK-35C could be refitted with Aiden cannon. Looking at the photographs, the cannon ports on the wings seemed to be covered over. It wouldn't make sense to build trainers that couldn't fight. It seems like it would have been a waste of resources. Let me know in the comments if the cannons could have been refitted. To deal with Draken's less forgiving low-speed behaviour, SAAB added small stall fin mounted under each outer wing at one of the spar attachment points, which subtly altered the airflow and made the aircraft's behaviour more predictable as it approached the edge of the envelope. 25 35As with short tail cones were converted to SK-35C configurations. The first aircraft, 35800, flew on the 30th of December 1959 and was used as the test platform for the conversion program, and it never entered operational service. On January 7th, 1963, SK-35C 35814, recently converted, was conducting a delivery acceptance flight when something went catastrophically wrong. A control cable overheated and severed. Lieutenant Lars Erik Jetson in the front seat and SAAB engineer Hans Pettersson in the rear had one option left. They ejected. Both rocket-powered seats fired successfully, both parachutes deployed, and both men survived. The aircraft, it punched through the ice on Lake Roxen and sank. It was later recovered from the lake bed. But that was secondary. The redesigned ejection system had just proven it could save lives when it actually worked as designed. From the start of the type conversion training through to the 1980s, not a single student coming directly from basic flight training was lost in an SK-35C accident. For an aircraft with superstall characteristics that had already claimed lives, that record validated the operational pilot's insistence on having a proper trainer. 21 years after that first successful ejection, the system would save lives again. On the 13th of March 1984, an SK-35C suffered an engine failure with an instructor and Danish student aboard. Both ejected and both survived. A total of 25 SK-35Cs entered operational service with F-16 wing from May 1962 through to June 1963, eventually transferring to F-10 wing when the type conversion course moved there in 1985. The type served until the 1990s, training every Swedish Draken pilot and many foreign ones. By 1963, Sweden had deployed 3 Draken variants, Adam, Bertil and Caesar, and learned lessons the hard way about operating a radical new configuration. These were the growing pains of building what was genuinely an unconventional design that broke new ground. But those early losses weren't ignored. Every modification, every system improvement, every lesson learned made Draken safer for the pilots who followed. SAAB now had enough operational data to build Draken as it was always intended to be, a high-altitude Mach 2 interceptor with modern radar and the performance margin to chase anything entering Swedish airspace. Or at least that was the plan. I want to take a second here to thank you so much for watching. I'm truly grateful to share my love of aviation with fellow enthusiasts like you. So if you're enjoying this story, please take a quick second to hit the like button. It's a small gesture that makes a huge difference in helping me reach more aviation fans. Now let's get back to the story. Aircraft 35274 was supposed to be the first production J35D. It never made it to a squadron. During ground testing at the Swedish Flight Research Center, a technician walked too close to the intakes during engine run-up. The RM-6C was barely idling, a whisper compared to full thrust, but the intakes were doing what they'd been designed to do: pull air. Any engine capable of pushing an aircraft past Mach 2 needs enormous volumes of air at any power setting, even idle. It happened in seconds. SAAB redesigned the intake warning procedures immediately, adding new markings and revising training protocols. After the accident, the aircraft remained at SAAB and the Flight Research Center for continued testing, where it was eventually converted to the S-35E reconnaissance variant, a different role for an aircraft marked by the worst kind of event. The J35D, designated David, was what Eric Bratt's team had probably been designing towards all along. The difference was the engine. Earlier Drakens had been fast, impressive even, but the J35D fitted with the RM-6C was something else entirely. On paper, the engine was a license-built Rolls-Royce Avon, specifically the Avon 300 series, but in practice it was distinctly Swedish. Built by Svenska Flygmotor, later Volvo Flygmotor, the RM6C was uprated, reinforced and paired with a Swedish designed afterburner, the EBK-67, that also changed the aircraft's appearance with extended and sharper air intakes. With the EBK-67 afterburner lit, the engine could produce around 17,500 pounds of thrust, enough to push the Draken into the same performance class as the Dassault Mirage 3, the American Convair F-106 Delta Dart and the Soviet MiG-21. The RM6C was the difference between Draken being a fast interceptor and becoming a true Mark II machine. But as we all know, there's no such thing as a free lunch. The RM6C was thirsty, especially in afterburner that could push the David up to 1,340 miles an hour. To make the performance usable, SAAB had to expand the internal fuel capacity of the J35D by roughly 600 litres and add twin belly stations for drop tanks for a ferry range of up to 1,700 miles. The aircraft gained reach, but only because the airframe was forced to grow around the engine. The fuselage itself had to be lengthened to accommodate that long EBK-67 afterburner, and that introduced its own quirks. The longer rear end increased risk of tail strikes during high-angle takeoffs and landings, which is why the lengthened fuselage Drakens gained their distinctive retractable roller skate tailwheels, an inelegant but highly effective solution to a very real geometry problem. And if the RM6C failed, Draken deployed a small pop-out ram air turbine known as Milan RAT to provide emergency hydraulic and electrical power. By the time the J35D entered service, the engine defined the aircraft. David could confidently take the Reds head on, and no matter what the Soviets sent, the Swedes would climb to meet them all the way up to 65,500 feet with a polite Swedish, "Hello, now go home." Beyond the raw speed increase, the D model was to finally be fitted with that Ericsson PS03/A radar, which was to be a huge improvement over the earlier PS02. But having a better all bells and whistles radar meant nothing without missiles that could exploit that capability. What Draken needed was a compact, high-altitude air-to-air missile that could attack from any angle, not just from behind like the heat-seeking RB-24 Sidewinder. Sweden, surprisingly, wasn't starting from zero. Swedish industry had been developing guided weapons since 1945, working with everything from captured German V-1 flying bombs that had come down on Swedish territory during the war to purpose-built radar-guided systems. SAAB and Bofors had programs underway throughout the early 1950s, the RB-04 air-to-surface missile, the RB-08 anti-ship weapon, and the RB-321 air-to-air missiles specifically designed to arm the next generation of Swedish interceptors. Sweden understood seekers, guidance logic, propulsion, and integration. The engineers were talented, the programs were serious, and the priority was high. What Sweden lacked was time. The RB-321 wasn't mature enough, development was taking longer than the threat timeline allowed, and by the late 1950s it was clear that if Draken was going to meet Soviet bomber threats when they arrived, its missile armament couldn't wait for domestic development to catch up. So Sweden looked west. Negotiations began in late 1958 when the Royal Swedish Air Force Materiel Administration, or the KFF, approached the US Air Force, Department of Defense and the State Department about purchasing Hughes GAR-1 and GAR-2 missiles, the semi-active radar and infrared variants that equipped the American F-102 and the F-106 interceptors. Negotiations dragged on for years. The problem wasn't technical. Hughes Aircraft Company was willing to sell. The issue was political. Advanced air-to-air missiles were considered sensitive technology, and exporting them outside NATO required careful diplomatic handling, even to neutral Sweden, despite its long-standing record of resisting Soviet influence. What wasn't publicly known at the time was that Sweden's neutrality masked a much deeper relationship with the West. Since the late 1940s, Stockholm and Washington had maintained a quiet, low-key security cooperation, intelligence sharing, and contingency planning designed to make sure that Sweden would not fall into the Soviet sphere in the event of war. And that unofficial alignment mattered. It allowed Sweden access to American weapons and technology that would otherwise have been out of reach for a formerly neutral state. For the United States, a strong Swedish air defense served Western interests whether Sweden carried a NATO flag or not. Every Soviet bomber intercepted over the Baltic was one less threat moving west. Eventually, in 1961, the deal came through. Sweden would license manufacture modified Falcon variants, the HM55 and HM58, later designated the RB27 and RB28, and were semi-active radar homing and infrared homing respectively. Unlike the heat-seeking RB24 Sidewinder that could only engage targets from behind where it could see the hot engine exhaust, the radar-guided RB27 could attack from any angle. Frontal shots, beam attacks, high-altitude intercepts where infrared signatures were weak. The Falcon gave Swedish pilots options that didn't exist with earlier weapons. Testing of the Falcons required creativity. Sweden needed to validate the missiles against realistic aerial targets under controlled conditions, which meant finding somewhere with airspace, infrastructure, and target drones. The solution? Holmen Air Force Base in New Mexico. Sweden hired an F-102 Delta Dagger as the shooting aircraft, one of the American interceptors the Falcon had been designed for, and purchased a batch of surplus MGM-1 Matador cruise missiles converted to remotely controlled target drones. Which means Sweden briefly operated cruise missiles even if they were only flying them to be shot down. The trials proved successful. The Swedish modified Falcons worked as intended, and SAAB could proceed with confidence that the weapons integration would function in operational service. Interestingly, the Swedish modifications and requirements proved important enough that the Americans later incorporated some from both variants, which led into the development of the AIM-26B, the USAF's conventional warhead Falcon. 120 J35Ds were built in 3 production batches, each with incremental improvements. The next 30 aircraft, I'll put the serial numbers on screen, were delivered starting in May 1963. But, here's a big but, that PS303 radar still wasn't ready. The same issue that had plagued the B model was now spilling over to the David. Even though they lacked the radar, they briefly flew with F-13 wing before being mothballed, where they spent the next 4 years gathering dust when they should have been greeting Soviet bombers. Squadron commanders, as you can imagine, weren't best pleased. They had pilots trained and ready, maintenance crews standing by, and the aircraft that couldn't fly operational missions because the electronics industry couldn't keep a pace with airframe production. The Davids remained in storage until 1966, when 29 were transferred back to SAAB for conversion to the reconnaissance variant, the S-35E. The remaining production batches, I'll put those serial numbers on screen, were sent to their home wings with full radar and systems from delivery. For nearly 2 decades until 1984, the David was the workhorse of Sweden's interceptor force once the teething problems were sorted, though those teething problems claimed lives while they were being sorted. 28th of April 1970, 4 J35Ds were flying advanced combat training. From 16,000 feet, the whole group entered a high-speed dive, a flight regime where margins were thin and control forces rose brutally fast. 2 of the 4 pilots felt it almost simultaneously. The rudder pedal stiffened, resistance built rapidly. The first aircraft, 35-33-2, yawed violently, rolling out of control. The pilot wrestled the aircraft before pulling the ejection handle. The canopy flew off, the seat fired. He survived, but badly injured with multiple broken bones, but alive. The second aircraft, 35-33-4, followed moments later. The pilot Sigvard Berg ejected at high speed, but whether it was incapacitation, parachute deployment failure, or insufficient altitude could never be determined with certainty. But Rolf Törnqvist, the pilot of 35-33-2, survived to explain what happened. At very high speed, the problem wasn't pilot input, it was physics. As airspeed increases, aerodynamic forces acting on the control surfaces rise exponentially. The faster the aircraft goes, the harder the airflow tries to hold the rudder in place. To overcome that, Draken relied on hydraulic servo actuators to amplify the pilot's inputs, but those servos were not infinitely powerful. In the high dynamic pressure regime the formation was flying in, the aerodynamic loads on the rudder approached the upper limits of what a hydraulic system could overcome. When that happened, the servos didn't fail catastrophically, they simply ran out of authority. To the pilot, it felt like the controls were freezing, increasing resistance with no proportional response. The rudder pedal still moved to a fashion, but the surface itself lagged behind or stopped responding altogether. This was later described as control surface movement limitations. Once the servo resistance reached its limits, the aircraft could no longer counter yaw effectively. Small disturbances grew instead of being corrected. Yaw fed roll, roll fed departure, and at those speeds and altitudes there was no margin and no time. Nothing was technically broken, the system was working exactly as designed, it had simply reached the edge of its envelope. And when an aircraft reaches that edge at high speed, it doesn't give you a warning, it just stops listening. SAAB's solution to the servo stall problem, and I'll put the Swedish word for it up on screen because there's no way I can pronounce that, was elegant in its simplicity. The engineers fitted what they called M-flaps, short for maneuvering flaps. The system automatically deployed the upper air brakes as pitch assist surfaces when the pilot pulled hard on the stick during high-speed turns. The air brakes themselves weren't new hardware, they were obviously already there. SAAB just gave them a second job. When the pilot pulled back on the control stick with more than 13 pounds of force, the M-flaps kicked in, creating additional pitch moment. This reduced the aerodynamic load the hydraulic servos had to fight against. Instead of the servos trying to muscle the entire control surface against 400 plus knot dynamic pressure, this is where they'd hit their physical limits and freeze. The M-flaps shared the workload. The D model also got something that would save lives in ways that canopy plungers could never do: a proper rocket boosted ejection seat. The SAAB 73 SEF could work from zero altitude, although it still needed a minimum forward speed of 62 miles an hour for safe ejection. Later D models got the superior SAAB RS-35, a true 0-0 system certified for ejection up to 700 miles an hour. This second generation seat was eventually retrofitted across all Draken variants. David had proven the concept. Now it was time to build what Draken had been growing towards all along: a complete weapons system. The J35F, designated Philip, was a true all-weather interceptor designed from the outset as a complete weapons system, not just a fast airframe with missiles bolted on afterwards. First deliveries went to F-13 wing beginning in mid-1965. By the time production ended in 1972, 230 aircraft had been built, making Philip the most numerous Draken variant and the backbone of the Swedish air defence for the next 2 decades. Philip retained the same RM6C engine as David, but almost everything forward of the cockpit was new. The aircraft was built around the Ericsson PS-01/A radar, and it was paired with the SAAB S7B fire control system. This gave Swedish pilots genuine collision course interception capability rather than being simple tail chasers. Compared to the earlier PS-03 sets fitted to the B and D models, detection range improved, tracking became more stable, and the entire system was progressively hardened against electronic countermeasures. From brake release, a Philip could be climbing through 33,000 feet in under 4 minutes. Now, to be clear here, that figure was the intercept climb profile, not Draken's much higher peak climb rate. The actual maximum climb rate varied by source, but under ideal conditions it could apparently hit much higher rates up to 44,000 feet per minute, though only for short bursts before the engine protested. But what truly set later Phillips apart sat beneath the nose. From late 1967 onward, the J35 F2 introduced a sensor that literally, quietly changed how intercepts were flown. The Hughes Infrared Search and Track System, known in Swedish service as the IR Spanari 71N, something that the earlier F-model aircraft, later designated the F1s, lacked entirely. Those jets relied solely on radar and ground control, and once the infrared system arrived, no one wanted to go back. Philip could now detect aircraft by their heat signature alone without emitting a single watt of radar energy. This was silent interception. Long before infrared search systems became common on Western fighters, Swedish pilots were watching targets appear as faint heat sources against the cold Baltic sky, sometimes tens of kilometers away before radar showed anything at all. For pilots transitioning from earlier variants, the experience was unsettling. The system often revealed contacts that seemed impossible at first glance, which led to some of them to assume these were false returns. They weren't false. The aircraft had simply learned to sniff out the Soviets in a new way. But the system had its limitations. It couldn't provide precise range data, so Swedish pilots compensated by using infrared detection to acquire the targets covertly, then slaved the radar for ranging and missile guidance at the last possible moment. In an era when jamming and radar warning receivers were becoming increasingly common, a sensor that couldn't be detected or interfered with was worth the trade-off. The aircraft typically carried two radar Falcons mounted on fuselage pylons, which were complemented by two infrared missiles under the wings. Sidewinders remained an option, but the Falcons were the weapons Philip was designed to fight with. Integrating American missiles, Swedish fire control logic, and their mixed radar infrared sensor suite was not trivial. SAAB invested heavily to make it work, including the construction of ultra-clean assembly facilities at Jönköping for missile homing heads. When everything came together, the result was an interceptor that could be guided by Strill 60, acquire targets passively, and launch without ever speaking on the radio. Falcon launches themselves were almost understated. Pilot Boss Enberg later recalled that firing one produced little more than a brief swoosh, a far cry from the tracer and clatter of the aiding cannon. The missile left so cleanly that pilots sometimes checked their instruments just to confirm it was gone. Speaking of cannon, Philip carried only one. To make room for the expanded avionics and missile integration, the left 33mm Aiden was removed. The remaining gun in the right wing carried around 120 rounds, but the message was clear: guns were no longer the primary solution. Missiles and systems that supported them had taken center stage. Philip's performance, however, came with consequences. Operating at the edge of the envelope left little room for error. In November 1967, the pilot of a J35 F1 lost control over the Baltic Sea whilst flying above Mach 1, another encounter with control limitations. The pilot ejected and survived, one of the first documented supersonic ejections in Swedish service. Philip entered service with 18 wings, where it remained as Sweden's primary interceptor until Viggen gradually assumed the role in the late 1980s. 67 aircraft would later be rebuilt to the J35 Johan standard, extended Draken's frontline service into the final years of the Cold War. Philip was the accumulation of everything SAAB had learned since Eric Bratt first sketched a double delta wing in 1949. Mach II performance, all-weather interception, silent target acquisition, radar-guided missiles capable of attacking from any aspect. Draken had finally become exactly what it was meant to be, and now it was time to put it to work. Quick reaction alert duty for Swedish Draken pilots meant waiting. A lot of waiting. You sat around in a dispersed forest space somewhere in Sweden, waiting for a klaxon that might never sound, whilst your aircraft sat under camouflage netting on a reinforced highway section hidden amongst the pine trees. Ground crews, mostly conscripts, waited nearby with refueling equipment and weapons trolleys. The entire operation was designed around a single brutal calculation. If the Soviets attacked first, Sweden's air force had to survive long enough to fight back. BAS-60, the dispersed basing system, made this possible by distributing fighters across the country in small hidden detachments. 800-meter highway sections had been pre-selected and reinforced, supply depots were buried in forests, and command posts operated from mobile trailers that could relocate within hours. Draken was specifically engineered to make this work. Conscript ground crews could refuel and reload weapons in under 10 minutes. Every element was built around this operational requirement. Each wing maintained QRA detachments with 4 aircraft at highest readiness, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. A lot of waiting, and occasionally something interesting would happen. Lieutenant Boss Enberg was flying a 2-ship sortie with F-16 wing at Uppsala in the early 1980s, practicing low-level dogfighting over the Baltic Sea. He had fewer than 100 hours on Draken, and his leader was also his instructor, standard practice for junior pilots still learning the aircraft. They were flying at about 100 feet altitude, rattling along at around 600 miles an hour, trying to keep visual contact while pulling high G turns over the water. Then a radio call came. Perform an identification of an unknown low-level object. Enberg's pulse jumped significantly, in his own words. This was his first real mission. Ground radar vectored them towards the target via Strill 60, and they stayed low and stayed fast whilst Enberg concentrated on following his leader, flying tight formation while scanning for the contact. Then, without warning, his instructor fully extended his air brakes and chopped the throttle. Enberg wasn't prepared. He flew straight past his leader, overtaking him before he could react. And then he looked forward and saw it. An Aviation 18 transport painted in Aeroflot livery, flying over the Baltic at 200 feet altitude. Enberg passed the target too, hammering his own air brake to full extension, throttle to idle, pulse now even higher again. His own description. He needed to get back in formation behind his leader, so he started a climbing left turn to reposition. According to Boss Enberg's account published in Hushkit Aviation World, he crossed in front of the Aleutian's flight path, a maneuver that the crew interpreted as a follow me signal, and the transport followed his Draken briefly until someone else, probably his instructor, took command and waved the transport back onto its original easterly heading. Enberg finally managed to slot back into proper position behind his instructor, and they reported the aircraft type and registration to the ground radar controller before heading home as fuel ran low. At the debrief, the older pilots had some good laughs at Enberg's expense. It would have been a good catch though, Enberg reflected years later, bringing home an Aviation 18 in my early career. Quick reaction alert operations weren't just about intercepting bombers and occasionally signaling follow me to Soviet transports by accident. They existed because of a darker operational reality. By 1987, Swedish military intelligence had documented at least 30 confirmed or probable Soviet operations in Swedish territorial waters, mostly occurring along the east coast, in the Stockholm archipelago and throughout the eastern military district. These weren't navigational errors, but deliberate incursions, and then Swedish counterintelligence discovered something that made the operational picture considerably darker. Soviet GRU intelligence personnel, posing as Polish art dealers, had visited the homes of over 100 Swedish Air Force officers. The assessment was unambiguous. Swedish counterintelligence assessed that the Soviets were planning to decapitate the Royal Swedish Air Force in the event of war by targeting key personnel, both pilots and ground crews, before they could mobilize and get airborne. Unabated operations continued for decades with hundreds of intercepts, and each intercept reinforced the message that Sweden's neutral airspace was defended and violations would be met with force if needed. But Sweden wasn't the only country watching these incursions. Other nations faced the same threats and they wanted the same aircraft. By 1968, SAAB had something most aircraft manufacturers dream about: a proven interceptor that actually worked. Not worked on paper or worked in ideal conditions or worked if you squinted at the specifications and ignored the maintenance cost, but worked in the real operational sense. 33 squadrons across the Swedish Air Force were carrying out hundreds of successful intercepts, achieving Mach 2 performance from reinforced highway sections and maintaining all-weather capability with a safety record that, aside from the servo stall and superstall issues they'd systematically addressed through modifications and training, was remarkably good for a first-generation supersonic interceptor. Other countries noticed. Denmark needed to replace the aging F-100 Super Sabres in the ground attack role whilst maintaining interceptor capability for NATO's northern flank. Finland needed an all-weather interceptor to defend its lengthy border with the Soviet Union without provoking Moscow by purchasing American equipment. Austria sought interceptors for Alpine air policing on a budget that ruled out new-build aircraft. Three nations, three entirely different operational contexts, and whilst those export Drakens defended Scandinavian and Alpine skies throughout the 1970s and 80s, Swedish test pilots were still sitting on a secret they'd discovered 2 decades earlier, something Eric Bratt's double delta wing could do that would eventually make a Soviet test pilot famous at the Paris Air Show. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Denmark became SAAB's first export customer in 1968, ordering 51 aircraft across 3 variants. The timing was perfect. Denmark needed replacements, SAAB had production capacity as Swedish orders wound down, and Draken offered Mach 2 performance at roughly $2.5 million per aircraft, which was reasonable by late 1960s standards. But the Danish requirement differed fundamentally from Swedish operations. Since Sweden built Draken as an interceptor for pure air defense against Soviet bombers, Denmark needed versatility because NATO's northern flank required ground attack capability alongside air defense. SAAB looked at the requirements and created the heaviest Draken variant ever flown, the Danish 35XD, which stood for Xerxes David or Export David, whichever one you prefer. This had structural reinforcements added that pushed the maximum takeoff weight to 16.5 tons, making it substantially heavier than any Swedish variant. Internal fuel capacity increased by 40%, and 9 weapons pylons gave the Danish Drakens flexibility Swedish interceptors never had. NATO standard bombs, rocket pods, AMG-12 bullpup guided missiles, and RB-24 sidewinders. The avionics also differed fundamentally from the Swedish machines. The Danish F-35 aircraft had no radar whatsoever, with the nose cone mostly metal serving as ballast to restore proper center of gravity once the bulky radar equipment after the cockpit was removed. The TF-35 trainer variant was delivered between 1976 and 77. These were hand-built using spares since series production of Draken had by that time ceased in favour of Viggen. Also, uniquely amongst Draken trainers, the TF-35 retained 1 cannon and was considered combat capable, unlike the completely unarmed Swedish SK-35C trainer. The RF-35 reconnaissance variant also kept both aid and cannon, unlike the Swedish reconnaissance Drakens, which deleted weapons entirely, since Danish planners expected the reconnaissance aircraft might need to fight their way out of trouble. 3 F-35 attack aircraft arrived at Karup Air Base on the 1st of September 1970s, delivered to Escadrille 725, whilst the RF-35 equipped Escadrille 729 at the same location. Both squadrons would operate Drakens for 23 years, and mid-1980s upgrades kept the Danish aircraft in the game for many more years to come. A comprehensive upgrade improved avionics, Marconi head-up displays, digital weapons aiming computers, and Ferranti laser rangefinders. Self-defense systems included radar warning receivers and jamming pods, and the final upgrade, completed in 1986, brought navigation and weapon delivery accuracy roughly equivalent to the F-16 Fighting Falcons that would eventually replace them. December 1993, Escadrille 729 flew the last missions before standing down. Finland's acquisition of Draken was an entirely different story, one determined by geography, politics and the delicate dance of maintaining neutrality while sharing a 1,300-kilometer border with the Soviet Union. Finnish neutrality wasn't quite the same as Swedish neutrality. Sweden chose to stay neutral. Finland was forced into it, constrained by the 1947 Treaty of Paris and subsequent agreements with Moscow that severely limited military capabilities, including a maximum of 60 fighter aircraft. During the Cold War, Finland walked a careful line between East and West when it came to defense procurement. The result was an inventory that looked like it had been assembled by committee. Soviet aircraft sitting next to British jets, Swedish fighters alongside French trainers, with Finnish domestic production filling in the gaps. Throughout the 1960s, Finland operated MiG-21 F-13s purchased from the Soviet Union, a political necessity. But the MiG-21 F-13 lacked all-weather combat capability, no radar intercept capacity, no night operations, complete dependence on ground control interception in daylight and clear weather. Soviet unwillingness to provide more capable variants left Finland unable to patrol its own airspace after dark or in poor conditions, a capability gap that was unacceptably limiting for an air force tasked with monitoring its very long border with Russia. Finland's challenge was not technical, it was diplomatic. When Finland sought to upgrade in the late 1960s, the political calculation was delicate. Purchasing American fighters would anger Moscow, and buying more Soviet aircraft would just perpetuate the capability gap. But purchasing Swedish aircraft from another neutral country, that might work. But behind the public negotiations, something else was happening. After quiet discussions between Finnish and Swedish politicians, unofficial conversations that never made it into formal records, Sweden began stockpiling surplus Drakens with a very specific purpose in mind. According to later accounts from participants on both sides, if Finland found itself at war with the Soviet Union, those Drakens would be transferred immediately. The practice continued through the 1980s, a Cold War insurance policy that both countries pretended didn't exist. In April 1970, the Finnish parliament approved purchase of 12 Drakens that became the XS variant. These were kit assemblies that Valmet would assemble under license at Korovesi. Everyone won, well, at least on paper. Finland maintained its neutrality, Moscow couldn't reasonably object to defensive fighters from neutral Sweden, and Sweden kept production lines warm. The first Finnish assembled Draken, DK-201, named Kake, the nickname for General Kaaku Poihonen, who served as the Chief of Staff of the Finnish Ministry of Defense, rolled out on the 12th of March 1974. But Finland needed training aircraft immediately, so 6 ex-Swedish J35Bs arrived in 1972 on lease, designated the 35BS. These radar-stripped aircraft proved perfect for transition training. Their improved thrust-to-weight ratio made them sprightly performers, as if they needed to be any more sprightly. The fleet grew in stages. In 1976, brought the purchase of the leased trainers, 3 SK-35C variants and 6 J-35Fs. In 1984, they brought the final batch, 18 more J-35Fs and 2 trainers. The total Finnish fleet were 47 aircraft across 4 variants, operating with Fighter Squadron 11 at Tikkakoski and later Rovaniemi and Fighter Squadron 21 at Pikala. The Rovaniemi deployment mattered. Northern Finland bordered the Soviet Union's Kola Peninsula, where much of the Northern Fleet operated, and Finnish Drakens based there covered the most sensitive portion of the border, taking part in numerous intercepts with even greater discretion than the Swedish operations. Those operational realities drove uniquely Finnish modifications. Unlike the Swedish J35F, which deleted one cannon, Finnish variants retained both 30mm Aidens, since Finnish doctrine assumed close quarters combat might be necessary during visual identification intercepts near the border, where rules of engagement and limited missile stocks meant gun kills remained a realistic scenario. The weapons situation perfectly captured Finland's balancing act. Finland had purchased Swedish-built RB-27 and RB-28 missiles for their Drakens during the 1970s and 80s, but also operated the Soviet R-13M heat seekers. The R-13M physical interface proved compatible with Draken's weapons stations that gave Finland options if Cold War tensions escalated and either Sweden or the USSR cut off missile supplies. Balance between East and West, ready to work with whoever would sell them what they needed. Draken had served Finland well, and their safety record spoke for itself, only 2 aircraft lost in 28 years. Finnish Drakens retired in August 2000, replaced by FA-18 Hornets. Austria became Draken's final military operator, flying the type long after other nations had retired theirs. In May 1985, Austria's Ministry of Defense signed contracts with SAAB for 24 refurbished J35 Davids. The purchase kicked up immediate controversy. Pacifist groups protested, environmental activists questioned Alpine jet operations, opposition politicians accused the government of unnecessary militarization. But SAAB's trade guarantees sweetened the deal, promising to purchase Austrian automotive and aerospace components in return. The political opposition faded. The selected aircraft came from 2 Swedish wings, each with roughly 2,000 flight hours remaining. SAAB refurbished each airframe at Linköping and modified it to the J35O standard, and had the bulged canopy from the J35 Phillips to better protect against bird strike. The first aircraft arrived on the 25th of June 1987, with all 24 going to Flieger Regiment 2, operating from Zeltweg and Graz-Tallerhof. One training mission is worth mentioning. On the 22nd of April 1987, Swedish test pilot Veikko Sunnell was conducting routine acceptance testing of J35O airframe 351414 from Linköping. It was to be a standard test flight. Fly south over Åland Island, turn east over the Baltic, gather performance data, and return for landing. Except this time Sunnell held the easterly heading slightly too long. Flying Mach 1.5 eastbound, the Baltic disappears quickly, and Soviet airspace, specifically Latvian airspace near Liepāja, lay barely 15 minutes away at full trot. Sunnell realized his navigation error only after crossing into Soviet airspace just north of Liepāja, immediately reversed course, lit the afterburner, and accelerated to maximum speed heading westbound. With the RM6C engine pushing out over 17,000 pounds of thrust of the EBK-67 afterburner, took 351414 and her hapless pilot well past Mach 2. Sunnell covered the distance back to Swedish airspace in a matter of minutes and landed back at Linköping without incident. Swedish military intelligence monitored Soviet radio traffic for reactions. Nothing. The authorities attributed it to a navigation error. Sunnell continued test flying, and 351414 was delivered to Austria on schedule, famous for its brief, inadvertent Soviet overflight. Austrian operations from 1987 through to 2005 proved remarkably uneventful. Routine air policing, lost civil aircraft, airliners with communication failures. No Soviet bombers probed Austrian airspace. Then June 1991 changed everything when Slovenia and Croatia declared independence. Austria's southern border became a war zone. Yugoslav Federal Air Force aircraft repeatedly violated Austrian airspace during operations against Slovenian forces, and Austrian J35O scrambled to intercept. No shots were fired, which was fortunate given what Austrian Drakens were carrying. The 1955 Austrian state treaty prohibited all guided missiles. Austrian J35Os flew with cannon-only armament, two 30mm aiding cannons and nothing else. By 1991, that looked increasingly absurd. Following the Soviet Union's collapse in December 1991, Austria declared the missile prohibition obsolete and purchased surplus Swedish AIM-9 Sidewinders in 1993. Later updates brought improved AIM-9 P5 variants plus electronic warfare systems, radar warning receivers and chaff flare dispensers salvaged from retired Danish Drakens. Austrian operations continued through 2005. The J35O flew on 23,500 flight hours and conducted approximately 500 QRA scrambles. November 25, 2005 saw the final Austrian Draken mission. In fact, these were the last Drakens in military service anywhere in the world. 50 years after the prototype's first flight, the Double Delta's operational career was over. Between Denmark's NATO northern flank operations, Finland's Soviet border patrols, and Austria's Alpine air policing, export Drakens accumulated hundreds of thousands of flight hours with remarkably low loss rates. Combined with Swedish service, total production reached approximately 650 aircraft. Other countries that had considered Draken, Switzerland came closest to purchasing it, with the likes of Venezuela, Belgium, Argentina, Chile, Singapore, Tunisia and Malaysia having all evaluated the type, but ultimately chose other aircraft. Late 1980s Paris Air Show. Soviet test pilot Viktor Pugachev was demonstrating the Sukhoi Su-27 flanker when the aircraft did something Western fighters weren't publicly demonstrated to do. The flanker's nose pitched violently upward, nearly vertical, hanging in the air as airspeed bled away, momentarily standing on its tail. Then the nose fell, the aircraft recovered cleanly, and the demonstration continued. Aviation press declared the Cobra maneuver a Soviet breakthrough. Analysts debated tactical implications. Pugachev became famous overnight as enthusiasts worldwide argued about what it meant that Soviet fighters could pull off this in public repeatedly on demand. In Sweden, test pilots and SAAB engineers who'd been flying Drakens for nearly 3 decades watched the coverage with polite interest. They'd been doing variations of this since the early 1960s. The superstall phenomenon had been documented since Little Draken's earliest flights. Draken entering deep stall at high angles of attack, then descending in a controlled, stable fashion like a falling leaf. But systematic flight testing in the early 1960s turned up something unexpected. Test pilots Bengt Olu and Ceylon Atterborn, working on mandatory superstall recovery training, discovered that deliberately entering superstall followed by aggressive recovery produced an unusual maneuver. The nose would snap violently upward to extreme angles before falling through and recovering to normal flight. During the high nose phase, airspeed decayed rapidly, the entire airframe acting as a giant air brake, producing deceleration far greater than conventional methods could achieve. Among pilots, this became informally known as court parade or short parade. Operationally, though, it had little value. The severe energy loss left the aircraft vulnerable immediately after execution. Any pursuing fighter could simply wait for recovery, then engage while Draken struggled to accelerate back to combat speed. But the maneuver proved controllable, repeatable, and safe if executed correctly, so training syllabi produced procedures for deliberate superstall entry and aggressive recovery. So pilots wrote their reports and Swedish officials filed everything away without public announcement, standard practice for a nation positioned between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And that's where the reports remained for decades. Then Pugachev demonstrated a Cobra. The Su-27's fly-by-wire controls, held by engine placement and generous power margins, made for longer, nose-high hold times and easier repeatability than Draken's purely mechanical and hydraulic controls ever could. But control authority came from fundamentally different sources: computer-mediated versus direct pilot force, stability margins that weren't comparable, engine response characteristics that behaved differently under the same conditions. But the core aerodynamic phenomenon, the extreme angle of attack, controlled deceleration through the post-stall regime, and then recovery to normal flight, was fundamentally similar. More than 2 decades separated the two. But Swedish officials watched the Cobra coverage, said nothing publicly, and went back to work. Very Swedish. Mid-1980s, Ängelholm Air Base, southern Sweden. The problem was straightforward. Interceptor coverage was fitting faster than new aircraft could replace it. JA-37 Viggen couldn't cover all wings quickly enough. JAS-39 Gripen was still years away from operational service. Meanwhile, Sweden's Draken fleet was aging and the Cold War wasn't over. In fact, it was intensifying under Reagan. Sweden needed interceptors now, not in 5 years when Gripen might be ready. The solution? Take low-hour J35 F2 airframes and give them comprehensive modernization, something that Sweden had tried before. The J35G, or Gustav, had been proposed years earlier. The idea was simple: convert 70 J35D airframes to carry the RB-05 air-to-ground missile, giving Sweden proper strike capability alongside its interceptor force. Engineering studies were completed, conversion plans drawn up, and budgets allocated. Then the project was cancelled before a single aircraft was modified. Viggen had made the concept strategically redundant, and the RB-05 itself was becoming obsolescent. In Swedish doctrine, air defense always came first anyway. Gustav became a footnote, one of those what-if variants that occasionally appears in reference books but never flew operationally. The J35J, or Johan, was the real solution. In 1985, Swedish air staff faced a clear calculation. Gripen wouldn't reach operational squadrons until at least the mid-1990s, possibly later if development hit delays. That meant the Draken fleet needed to remain combat effective for another decade. Simple updates wouldn't cut it. The threat had changed since the 1960s. Soviet bombers now carried sophisticated electronic countermeasures that could jam or spoof earlier Swedish radars. Their fighters also operated at lower altitude, where Sweden's existing infrared sensors struggled to find and lock onto targets against the ground clutter. Against this backdrop, the modification program was approved quickly. The first converted J35J aircraft were delivered in March 1987, and the changes were substantial. PS-011A radar replaced earlier systems with improved detection ranges, more stable tracking, and significantly greater resistance to contemporary Soviet electronic countermeasures. The infrared search and track sensor, already fitted to later Philip variants, got upgrades that improved low-level performance. This let pilots detect targets flying at wavetop height over the Baltic, where radar performance was limited by sea clutter and jamming. 2 additional hardpoints increased weapons capacity from 4 to 6 missiles. The new pylons were wired specifically for modern sidewinders, the all-aspect RB-74 and improved RB-24Js. However, the airframe could still carry the older RB-27 and RB-28 Falcon missiles. The 30mm cannon installation was updated to increase service life, along with updated external tank integration to increase patrol endurance. Structural reinforcements also extended the fatigue life. Even though the selected J35 F2 airframes had relatively low flight hours, they still needed strengthening for another decade of operational service. 66 or 67 aircraft were converted, depending on which source you trust. The prototype J0 sometimes gets counted separately. All went to F10 winger Ängelholm, making Johan exclusively a southern Sweden aircraft. Pilots who transitioned from earlier Drakens to the J35J found themselves flying what felt like another aircraft entirely. The upgraded radar could detect targets the old PS-03 would have missed entirely. The improved IRST sensor picked out aircraft at ranges that seemed impossible, faint heat signatures against the cold Baltic sky long before visual acquisition. But some things remained the same. Landing still meant watching your angle of attack meter like a Swedish hawk, and high G turns still bled energy at alarming rates if you weren't careful with throttle management. Bossenberg's description from the 80s remained accurate. You didn't fly Draken casually. June 20th, 1991, F-10 wing. J35J serial number 35522 had just lifted off the runway when pilot Pierre Lundqvist discovered something was wrong. The control stick wouldn't move correctly. His leg fixation straps, designed to prevent leg flail during high G maneuvers, had interfered with the stick's travel. At 100 feet altitude, barely off the runway, and with insufficient altitude to troubleshoot, Lundqvist had one option. He pulled the ejection handle. The canopy blew clear, the seat fired, and the parachute deployed. Just 100 feet, that's roughly a 10-story building. The SAAB RS-3500 ejection seat did exactly what it was designed to do, and Lundqvist walked away. The aircraft unfortunately didn't. By the mid-1990s, the operational picture had changed completely. The Soviet Union had collapsed in December 1991. The Cold War was over, and while Baltic patrols continued, the intensity had dropped. More importantly, Gripen was finally entering service. JAS-39 could do everything Draken could do, plus ground attack, reconnaissance, and network-centric operations that the 1950s era Draken was never designed for. Easier to maintain, more capable, more modern, everything contemporary air combat demanded. December 8, 1998, F-10 wing Ängelholm. The last operational J35J sortie took off into Swedish winter sky, flew its final patrol, and landed without ceremony. 12 years, that's how long the stopgap lasted. Sweden's bet on the J35J had paid off exactly as planned. Keep Draken combat effective until Gripen was ready, then retire the Dragon with dignity. And for pilots who'd mastered the Dragon's quirks, few aircraft would ever offer the same satisfaction. 43 years after Bengt Olu lifted prototype 35-1 off the runway at Linköping, the operational watch was finally ending. 651 Drakens had been built, thousands of pilots trained on the type, and many thousands of sorties flown, decades of Baltic patrols conducted, and not one single shot fired in anger. Which meant the aircraft had done exactly what it was designed to do. By the mid-1990s, the Cold War had been over for half a decade, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and the mission had changed. Modern air combat now needed beyond visual range engagement, data fusion from multiple sensors, network-centric operations, and much, much more. Multi-role flexibility that could handle ground attack, reconnaissance, and air defense from the same airframe. Draken was a pure interceptor from an era when that was enough. The JAS-39 Gripen was already entering service, more capable, more modern, easier to maintain. But pilots who flew both aircraft understood what they were losing. Gripen could do more, but Draken demanded more. You couldn't fly it casually. It required attention, skill, and respect throughout every phase of flight. The double delta configuration forgave many errors, but punished carelessness without mercy. Landing demanded precision because the approach characteristics left little margin. High alpha maneuvering required constant awareness of the energy state. Flying it well meant knowing the aircraft intimately, understanding its quirks, respecting its limits, and for pilots who mastered it, few aircraft offered the same satisfaction. In my opinion, what Draken proved mattered more than the aircraft itself. A country of 7 million people, neutral with no alliance backing, built a Mach II interceptor that worked. Not worked on paper or worked in ideal conditions, but worked in the operational sense that mattered. Sweden maintained credible air defense throughout the Cold War despite neutrality, limited budget, and small population. Draken made that possible through clever design and engineering. When Soviet bombers tested Swedish airspace, they found interceptors ready to respond. The message was clear enough, and deterrence worked because the capability was real. Museums preserve dozens of airframes. The Swedish Air Force Museum at Linköping displays multiple variants. Prototype 35-1, the aircraft Bengt-Olof flew on that first flight in October 1955, sits preserved at Svendinerspill and Flygmuseum at Ugglarp. Total surviving airframes number in the dozens, a tiny fraction of the 651 built, but enough to ensure the type remains visible for future generations. Swedish military culture doesn't do theatrical farewells. The final flight received minimal media coverage. A formation flypast, some photographs, a brief ceremony at F-10 wing. Draken had done its job. Gripen would take over. Life continued without sentiment. The Dragon's watch is over, and the pilots who flew it moved on to other aircraft and other missions. So, past the Aquavit, here's to Odin, and to the engineers who believed in slide rules to keep their country safe. Right, so that's Draken, Swedish engineering brilliance that started with Eric Bratt staring at an impossible problem with nothing but a slide rule. I have to say this one's been absolutely great to research. The amount of Swedish documentation I've had to translate. My Swedish is probably now approximately good enough to order a coffee and discuss the aerodynamic properties of double delta wings, which is a very specific skill set. Okay, Google did most of the heavy lifting. For 2026, I want to do more stories about the people behind the machines because honestly, Eric Bratt's story deserves its own documentary. The man was 33 years old when he got handed Project 1200 and told, "It's temporary, we'll find someone more experienced," and then he proceeded to design one of the most successful interceptors of the Cold War. I've got my eye on a few stories for next year, some Soviet, some American, a couple of British ones that need the super deep dive treatment. The engineers, test pilots, some ground crews, the humans who made these machines work. Because here's the thing, we can talk about thrust to weight ratios, wave drag and vortex lift all day, and I will gladly, but at the end of it, someone had to strap themselves into that cockpit for the first time. Someone had to look at a wing and say, yeah, I'll fly that. That takes a special kind of person. Anyway, if you made it this far, genuinely thank you. Over an hour of some British guy talking about aircraft is proper commitment for a YouTube video. So if you've enjoyed it, please hit the like button, leave a comment, tell me what you'd like to see next. And if you spotted any errors, because despite my best efforts, something always slips through, let me know. The aviation community here on YouTube is brilliant for that. It keeps me honest. So, right, on to the next one, and I'll see you, well, for the next one. Toodaloo.